Hi guys. Okay, so this is the PowerPoint lecture for this week. I've said week 4, even though it was originally intended to be week 2, but yeah, we missed 2 weeks, so I thought it would just make more sense just to start it from where we're actually at rather than trying to go back. Okay, so week 4, Macbeth, second Macbeth lecture that we're going to have. Okay, so last time we saw that the intimacy which exists between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth in the opening acts of the play. That's Act 1 and Act 2. We saw that they appear to understand each other and to know each other's desires, and we see how this intimacy enables the couple to drive each other to murder. And as this is a tragedy, and as they've just killed someone, we know that it's probably not going to go very well from here, but we will focus today on the way in which the relationship between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth kind of atrophies and becomes less and less intimate and more withdrawn and isolated as the play progresses. So we won't be talking about everything in the rest of the play this week. We're just going to be very largely focusing on the relationship between these two. Okay. So, following the murder of Duncan, Macbeth is crowned King of Scotland, and almost as soon as the witch's prophecy is fulfilled, he begins to realize that he does not feel fully secure in his position. He develops a blinding jealousy of Banquo, who remember as his best friend and comrade from the battle at the start of the play, whom the witches stated would give birth to an entire line of kings. And we can see this jealousy and this insecurity in Act 1, Scene 3. If we start here, when Macbeth is alone on the stage, he says, "To be thus is nothing, but to be safely thus." What he means by this is to be king is nothing, but to be king securely, to be king with no possible threats against you. Now that really would be something. And then he goes on to think about Banquo, and he says, "Our fears in Banquo stick deep." So he's deeply afraid of Banquo. And in his royalty of nature reigns that which would be feared. So he claims there's something about Banquo's nature, something about just how good he is as a person, which makes him fearful and makes him dangerous. And then he says, "He chid the sisters when first they put the name of king upon me, and bade them speak to him. Then prophet-like they held him father to a line of kings, while upon my head they placed a fruitless crown and put a barren scepter in my grip." So Macbeth at this point is ruminating on the idea that he's not going to produce anything. There's nobody's going to be king after him. So the future, which we're going to talk about later as well, and which we talked about last week as well, not last week, but in the last reading of the play that we did, is now becoming very stale. It's now very monotonous. There's nothing new which is going to come from Macbeth now. There will be no children who will carry on his name or carry on his line. And he says thus, "For Banquo's issue have I filed my mind. For them the gracious Duncan have I murdered." So filed here could mean defiled, which means to pollute or to make something wholly profane and to make something dirty, but it could also mean filed in the literal sense of when you file something, you kind of grind it down, and it's quite a painful process, quite a painful thing to think about. And Macbeth is also suffering very much at this point from the kind of guilt that he feels over Duncan's murder. He says he has put rancors in the vessel of my peace. Rancors, according to the footnote here, are ideas of hatred. He's made himself angry. He's full of all these conflicting feelings, and he's allowed his peace to be disturbed because he's murdered Duncan, and he's done that. He's now thinking at this point for the sake of Banquo. So he's very angry about this, and he's very churned up. And then in the following scene, Macbeth confides in his wife that he cannot sleep due to nightmares and that his mind is quote-unquote full of scorpions. So we can see this in the following scene, in which Lady Macbeth comes in and she does kind of try and comfort her husband. You do see a kind of intimacy and a kind of care here. And we realise that Macbeth has been keeping himself isolated. They've been keeping away from each other, or at least he's been keeping away from her, and she wants him to come back to society and to kind of be the man that he used to be. And she says, "Why do you keep alone? Of sorrowest fancies your companions making, using those thoughts which should indeed have died with them they think on." So she says that he makes his companions sorrowest fancies, so he's kind of brooding, and he's thinking sad, hateful thoughts, and they're his only companions. And she says they should be gone with the people that they're about. So you should have stopped thinking about Duncan when Duncan doesn't exist anymore. Things without all remedy should be without regard. So things that we can't fix, we shouldn't think about. And then what's done is done. There is no way to get Duncan back. They've killed him. They need to move on. And then Macbeth responds in a way which feels a bit kind of maniacal. Again, we get the sense that he's been brooding on his own for quite a long time. He says, "We have scorched the snake, but not killed it. So we have wounded something, but we haven't done away with it. We haven't fully gotten rid of whatever it is that was threatening us, or that might be threatening us." And Macbeth isn't really specific here, but you just kind of get this sense that he's becoming intensely paranoid, and he's becoming more and more distracted by the idea of perceived threats to his power and perceived threats to the throne. And then we read that he sleeps in the affliction of these terrible dreams that shake us nightly. So he's having nightmares every night, and he doesn't really say what they're about, whether they're about Duncan's murder, whether they're about the witches, whether they're about something else, but we know that he's suffering a lot at this point, and he's not sleeping, which again is a recurring idea in Macbeth. The absence of sleep and the inability to sleep is one of the most common complaints that the Macbeth himself has, and it really affects the way that he relates to everything, really. But then again, Lady Macbeth tries to bring him back to the world. She reminds him that they're going to have a dinner tonight, and he says, "Let your remembrance apply to Banquo." So pay attention to Banquo. Be nice to him. Present him eminence both with eye and tongue. Be friendly to him, even though we're making our faces vizards to our hearts. And a vizard is a kind of mask. So even though we're very suspicious of Banquo, or Macbeth is very suspicious of Banquo, he tells Lady Macbeth to be kind to him, to be friendly to him, and not to let him know that anything is wrong. It's worth pointing out at this point as well that Macbeth has no real reason to fear Banquo other than the fact that he knows what the witches said, and that he has a slight suspicion that Macbeth may have been involved in Duncan's murder, but he has no proof of that. And Macbeth says that he's going to do something, a deed of dreadful note. And Lady Macbeth responds, "What's to be done?" And he says, again, quite tenderly, "Be innocent of the knowledge, dearest Chuck." Chuck is just an affectionate term for, honey, dear, those kinds of words. "Don't worry about it, honey, till thou applaud the deed. So I will show you what I'm going to do, but only once it's done. Until then, the innocent of it. And then he kind of invokes the night to come and let them move on, get the day over with. So again, we see this kind of remnant of intimacy and continuing intimacy between the two, but we also see that Macbeth is becoming increasingly paranoid, that he's not confiding as much as he used to in his wife, and that he is also, and that she, is trying to, rather than having an intimate conversation with him, she's just trying to bring him back to the world and trying to get him to focus on what's actually going on and what's actually in front of him. And at this point, Macbeth then goes on to order the murder of Banquo and of his son Fleance, who escapes the murderers. And as we've seen, he doesn't tell Lady Macbeth that he's going to do this, and he doesn't consult with her, he just does it. And one thing which is worth saying is that in terms of the tragic arc of the plot, this is kind of Macbeth's absolute point of no return. Not only has he killed Duncan, but he has now also killed his best friend for no real reason other than his own jealousy and his own paranoia. And following on from this, we get the scene, which is a very famous scene in Macbeth, in which Macbeth is just before this kind of dinner that Lady Macbeth mentions, where they're going to host these nobles and they're going to generally show off their kingship and try and have a good time, but also try and make sure that the lords of Scotland are on their side. Macbeth is told that Banquo is dead, but that Fleance escaped. And despite knowing that he's dead, Macbeth makes a toast to Banquo and says that he wishes he was here in front of everyone else. And at that point, Macbeth hallucinates the ghost of Banquo with several gashes in his head, sitting at the king's seat at the table. He becomes distraught and begins to scream at the ghost to leave him alone, denying that he himself committed the murder. And the queen says to him, she says, "Snap out of it." Interestingly, she mentions something that we didn't talk about last week, but before Macbeth murders Duncan, he has a vision of a dagger when he's alone on stage, and he kind of gives a soliloquy and talks to it. And Lady Macbeth mentions this and says, "This is just another hallucination, like that dagger that you told me about." And one of the reasons why this is interesting is because, again, it just shows that, they tell each other everything. We don't see them talking about the dagger. We don't see Macbeth telling Lady Macbeth that he's had this kind of hallucination and that he went temporarily mad and saw a dagger pointing away to Duncan. But we know that he's told her that and he's confided in her, because she brings it up again now and says, "Look, you're seeing things again." And then at the same time, she tells the nobles who are gathered around that Macbeth has kind of had fits from childhood, and that he sometimes has hallucinations and that it'll pass. That's a lie, but Lady Macbeth makes it up to kind of try and, you can say, to save face and to try and cover over the fact that her husband is becoming increasingly unstable. And yeah, that doesn't work, and they end up having to call off the dinner, and Banquo's ghost leaves. And Macbeth kind of finally settles down, although he expresses suspicion that Macduff, one of Duncan's nobles, and the person who will eventually kill him at the end of the play, didn't attend the banquet, and he begins to worry that Macduff is now someone that he needs to fear. And if you know, one thing we can notice about this straight away is that Macbeth moves very quickly from fearing Banquo to fearing Macduff, as if there's no real end to the point, to his paranoia. He says he wants to be safely king, but we can think about whether or not there's any real point at which he would feel safe once you're kind of obsessed about your own vulnerability. Is there any point in which you can really begin to feel safe again, or will you just move your anxiety on to the next thing that comes along? And Lady Macbeth again mentions sleep and says that her husband needs to sleep, and that they should retire to bed. And we can see this here. So this is all the guests have left after the dinner, and Macbeth says, "It will have blood," they say. "Blood will have blood. Stones have been known to move and trees to speak." So he's trying to rationalize the hallucination that he's just seen, and he says maybe it's magic, things like this do happen. And then he kind of starts snapping out of it and says to his wife, "What is the night?" Just so you kind of have this moment where he's like, okay, what time is it? And she says almost as odds of the morning, so essentially midnight. Something worth noting is that time in Shakespeare is usually whatever time of day the plot needs it to be, and time moves very quickly. So it was presumably about 7 or 8 p.m. dinner time when the banquet started, and now it's midnight. So yeah, but don't worry about that. It just happens. And then he goes on to say, how sayest thou that Macduff denies his person at our great bidding? So what do you think that Macduff didn't come? And Lady Macbeth says, "Did you send to him, sir?" So they're not. Notice how her tone has changed from how it was in the first act. She's not commanding him anymore. She's not telling him that she knows him. She's backing off a little bit, and she seems to be genuinely worried about him. And then he says, "And betimes I will to the weird sisters," those are the witches, "more shall they speak, for now I am bent to know by the worst means the worst. So I will consult the worst people, the most evil people, in order to find out the worst thing that can happen to me." And again, he's not really listening to his wife at this point. He's not really paying attention to her. He's now fixated on the witches, and he's turning to them instead of her. And she just responds quite quietly by saying, "Look, you need to sleep." She says, "You lack the season of all natures, sleep." The season of all natures means kind of, here you have the footnote, it means seasoning, which is just, the thing that makes personalities what they are and good. If you haven't slept, if you can't sleep, you lose your personality, you lose your characteristics, you become cranky, you become unhappy, you become a different kind of person. And Macbeth says, "Come, will to sleep. My strange and self-abuse is the initiate fear that wants hard use." So he almost says, we've got to do more. So he's being driven on at this point by his kind of, by his obsession over his own safety, by his guilt, and by his fear. And Lady Macbeth is being pushed aside in all of this. He's still kind of with her, but he's withdrawing more and more. And she has less and less to say other than just kind of express little bits of concern, like, "You lack this season of all nature's sleep." And then that is the last time that we see them together as a couple. We'll skip Act 4 because while things happen which are important for the overall plot, it's largely about Macbeth going to see the witches again, and then about Macduff and Duncan's sons raising an army in England in order to kind of come and take the throne back from Macbeth, during which time Macduff's family is killed again because Macbeth orders it. So when we do see Lady Macbeth again, it's the start of Act 5, and we kind of get introduced again in a very famous scene. We get introduced to her as someone who a doctor and a nurse are very concerned about because she is sleepwalking every night. Excuse me. And when she's sleepwalking, she's hallucinating. This is Act 5, Scene 1. Or she's dreaming, or she's having a waking dream. It's very hard to tell. And we read, "In the slumbery agitation, besides her walking and other actual performances, what at any time have you heard her say? So the doctor's saying that to the nurse. And the gentlewoman, so the nurse, says, I will not repeat what she says. And then she enters, Lady Macbeth enters holding a candle. And she starts pretending to obsessively wash her hands. Remember, after Macbeth kills Duncan, Lady Macbeth, in a very pragmatic manner, comes back in and washes her hands of the blood that she has on them, because she had to put the daggers back where she found them. And now when she's sleepwalking, she's obsessively washing her hands. And she says, yet here's a spot. So the blood, she's hallucinating that the blood is still there. Then she says, out, damn spot, out, I say, 1, 2, why then, 'tis time to do it. Hell is murky. Again, famous quote. She's really suffering at this time. She may think she's in hell, she may not, she may be dreaming, she may be half awake. We don't really know. Then she says, the Thane of Fife had a wife, where is she now? That's a reference to Macduff's wife, who was murdered on Macbeth's orders. And then we have, what will these hands ne'er be clean? So she's moved from having this kind of confidence and assertiveness in the first 2 acts to being deeply vulnerable and deeply traumatized by the events that she herself has partaken in, that she's taken part in. And then one of the most moving bits of the scene is that she starts to talk to Macbeth, and she starts to say, don't worry, my husband, I tell you yet again, Banquo is buried, he cannot come out on his grave. So we get this kind of echo of the previous scene, but we also get the sense that Lady Macbeth has been talking and worrying frantically about her husband, but her husband is nowhere to be seen at this point. Macbeth has become even more and more withdrawn. And Lady Macbeth then says, to bed, there's knocking at the gate. Come, 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 give me your hand. What's done cannot be undone. Remember that line from previously in Act 3. To bed, to bed. So we go from assertive, confident Lady Macbeth to traumatized, repeating the same sentences, repeating sentences that she's previously said to her husband, but this time she's very isolated, she's very alone. And the final thing she says in the play, again, a sleep reference, to bed, to bed, to bed. And then she walks out, she sleepwalks out, and we don't know where she goes. So, in contrast to Lady Macbeth, who is now kind of this is this isolated person who is overflowing with feeling and regret, Macbeth has lost almost all feeling. He's become convinced that he cannot be harmed because the witches tell him when he goes to see them that no one will depose him until Burnham Wood, a nearby forest, comes to his castle, and that no one of woman born can kill him. This turns out to be a trick, but look that up on Wikipedia. It's not, in my opinion, the most interesting part of the play. And then in Act 5, later on, there's an army closing in. Macduff and Malcolm, Duncan's son, have their army. They're closing in on the castle. And Macbeth hears women screaming and is informed that Lady Macbeth is dead. And will usually infer that she's killed herself, even though the text itself does not necessarily insist on that. But it's usually how it's interpreted. So, and then he gives a speech. So I'll just read this bit, then I'll go to the text. Then he gives a speech, which displays his more or less total resignation, his complete abandonment of hope, and his conviction that life is completely meaningless and that it means nothing. This is not in any way, or should not in any way, be read as Shakespeare's view on anything, but it's in some ways it's the kind of final stage that Macbeth gets to at the end of the play. And yeah, it's not a good place to be. But we can just see this here slightly. And Macbeth hears the cry of women, and then he says, I have almost forgot the taste of fears, so I've almost forgot what it was like to feel afraid. The time has been my senses would have cooled to hear a night shriek, and my fell of hair would at a dismal treatise rouse and stir. So my hair it used to be that my hair would stand up, and that my senses would freeze with fear if I heard a scream like that, but now I feel almost nothing at all. And then he says, wherefore was that cry? Wherefore, remember, means why, not where. Wherefore art thou Romeo means why are you called Romeo, not where are you. Little bugbear of mine about people understanding Shakespeare, but anyway. And then Satan says, the queen, my lord, is dead. And then Macbeth responds by saying she should have died hereafter. What a thing to say when you've just found out your wife is dead. What that means is that she would have died anyway at some point. And then he says, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to the last syllable of recorded time. So days just go on at this kind of repeating pace. And all our yesterdays have lighted fulls the way to dusty death. Out, brief candle. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. So we get the sense that his final judgment on life is this kind of repetitive, slow, plodding along that means nothing and goes nowhere. And it may be full of sound and fury, so there may be a lot of action and there may be a lot of crying and a lot of shouting and a lot of cheering in life, but ultimately all of that signifies nothing. That's what Macbeth says when he hears that his wife has died. He doesn't try to give her life a meaning, he doesn't remember anything about the love that they shared or about their relationship, but it's purely this statement of complete resignation. So, what do we take from this? Macbeth is most famous for its supernatural elements and for what appear to be its moral lessons about ambition and power, but I honestly don't think that's as interesting as the relationship in the play and as thinking about the play as actually a play about the breakdown of a relationship. We see the central pair move from close communication and trust to an increasing distance, which resolves into isolation, insanity, and suicide. And we saw in the build-up to the murder of Duncan an inability to deal with the passage of time. The past and the future has a huge amount to do with all of this, okay? So, when we're nearly finished now, but just to hammer home some of the points. When Macbeth first moves to murder Banquo, he is obsessed with the idea that the witch's prophecy will come true for his friend, meaning that Banquo effectively owns the future. In his reworking of the play, the post-war German dramatist Heiner Müller, who I think is great, but it's definitely quite wacky, has the murderers bring Macbeth Banquo's genitals, and he kind of waves them around on the stage and says, and celebrates the fact that he has sterilized the future. He kind of says, I've gotten rid of the future. Everything is mine now because there will be nothing that Banquo has nothing to come after him because I've literally taken away his capacity to reproduce and also killed him. So yeah, make of that what you will. In Act 3, we see Lady Macbeth attempt to persuade her husband to move on from Duncan's murder and to stop worrying about the future. So stop living the past and stop worrying about the future. We saw how that conversation plays out, but Macbeth is unable to do this. And as we've said before, Shakespeare ties this incapacity to deal with time to Macbeth's insomnia. After all, sleep is that thing which divides days from each other and which enables us to understand the passage of time. Anyone who has ever experienced insomnia will say that it is partly an experience of the interminability of time, as the night stretches on and on with nothing to fill the empty hours. And then, as her husband withdraws from her more and more, we see that as Lady Macbeth, who becomes fixated on the traumatic event of Duncan's murder, repeating the act of washing her hands over and over to herself in her sleepwalking. We've talked about that. Macbeth's final speech, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, is an articulation of a completely empty experience of time in which stale moment follows stale moment, with nothing to distinguish one from the other. Ultimately, it may be that this is the price, final thought, that both individuals, both Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, pay for the attempt to escape this ignorant present. Remember, that's what Lady Macbeth says to Macbeth when they greet each other for the first time after the witches have made the prophecy. And to feel the future in the instant, and to bring the future into the instant by murdering Duncan and fulfilling the witch's prophecy as quickly as possible. So final thought, is it really the act of murder which is the great sin or the great crime that Macbeth and Lady Macbeth commit? Or is it also this attempt to kind of cheat time and to make the future happen as soon as possible? I'll leave that up for you guys to decide. So, task for this week. Again, once more, I know that the course is more disrupted than normal, and it's already pretty disrupted, so sorry, but I am okay now, back to full health, and there shouldn't be any more further interruptions. If you guys just watch the scenes that are uploaded to eCampus and try and read the extracts as well. Again, Shakespeare is hard, but, we're at university and you guys are smart, so I'm sure you'll be able to cope with most of it. And as an exercise to keep you engaged, try to write down 5 different aspects of Macbeth and Lady Macbeth's relationship. Do this in your own words and in a manner which would enable you to explain it to a friend who isn't familiar with the play. And yeah, if you don't have to send me this work if you don't want to. It's just for you guys to keep engaged and to have something to do with the material, with your own brains. But if you want to send me it, then please go ahead and I will have a look at it when I get the chance, okay? And yeah, have a good week. I'll post material for the first week of Othello, probably towards the end of next week, because we won't have a class next Monday because the uni's closed, but I'll post some material towards the end of next week. And we'll be having a catch-up meeting as well at the start of the next class, or during the next class. So I'll post a Zoom link or a Google Meet link for that too, and I'll send you all a reminder closer to the time. So, okay guys, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you got something out of it, and I will speak to you again soon. Bye.